The heir is hatching. Vizan must come at once.
Morel had not bothered to knock before he flung open our dwelling door to make his announcement. Crass behaviour for a first herald, I thought, even if he did have urgent news. His sudden appearance had made me spill the herbal drink I'd just mixed, and I took a moment to ladle more from the pot over the fire into the beaker in my paw. It gave me something to do that didn't involve thinking about the problems and complications that Morel's news brought. As he folded his wings and stepped over the threshold in response to my nod, I voiced the most immediate concern. "Vizan can't come. You know he's ill."
But he must.
Morel's dark mane was sticking up in alarm, and I didn't envy him telling Callis that Vizan wouldn't be there.
The Fate Seer has to be present at the hatching of a prime's egg, especially...
He snapped his jaw shut on further comment, but it was easy enough to guess what he hadn't said, especially now, when the egg had been laid by a female who had had the sickness. I could have told Morel that having a Fate Seer present for a hatching had made no difference to Karma, or Lisha, or to nines of other females. In every case they had counted themselves fortunate to survive the sickness, and in every case the eggs they'd laid had produced... I pulled my thoughts from those poor crippled hatchlings, and snapped at Morel to close the door. The last thing Vizan needs is a cold draught ruffling his fur. The faint salt tang of an onshore breeze vanished along with the draught as he was bid, but it was clear from the way he wrinkled his snout and flattened his ears that he thought he might catch something by coming further inside. I had felt that way too 7 moons before, on the day I had first become Vizan's apprentice. When he'd ushered me through the door, a trader's youngling who had expected to spend her life flying from cluster to cluster with goods and provisions, I had half expected to find decaying piles of sacrificial bones under the table. But the Fate Seer's dwelling was much the same as any other. The wall stones set one on another to spiral upward and inward, a fire glowing in the hearth to one side, a well-scrubbed vine-bark table, upholstered sitting stools, zaxel stems scattered across the floor, and a woven reed screen in front of the nests. However, only this dwelling had bunches of healing herbs hanging from the roof stones, and jars of ointments and salves lining the shelves. Only this dwelling had baskets of dried camel leaves, twists of xenox powder, and handfuls of chalk moss scattered across the workbench, waiting to be sorted beneath the light that streamed through the seashell. It also had a sticky patch on the floor where the herbal mix had just spilled, and I heard Morel's grunt of disgust as he stepped in it. "Vizan's over here." I ushered Morel around the screen, and saw his nose and whiskers twitch as he caught the scent of the drink I had mixed, a smell which did not quite mask the sickly odour emanating from the Fate Seer's nest. "Now do you see why he can't come?" I crouched low to hold the beaker under Vizan's black-striped snout. His nose barely twitched, but he opened one eye and managed to sip a little of the hot liquid. It was hard to bear the sight of his once imposing body lying helplessly in a soiled nest. His greying fur was matted, because brushing it made it fall out. He couldn't even summon the energy to tuck his tail around his legs, and it hung limply over the edge of the nest. His breathing rattled wetly, with a noise like wave-driven pebbles, and as I placed a paw on his shoulder to help him change position, I could feel the bones beneath the skin. I looked up to find Morel spiralling a paw across the front of his grey tunic, in the age-old gesture of prayer, his ears dipped to the correct angle of respect.
"May the spiral watch over him."
He scratched at the thin beard under his chin, clearly unsure what he should do. He was as new to his role as I was to mine. Neither of us knew what the protocol was. After a beat or two, Morel set his ears upright.
"If Vizan is not well enough to come, then you must. Callis is frantic," he said. He rubbed a paw over the brown fur on his snout, and I noticed that the skin beneath bore a pattern of red marks.
Vizan coughed, and I set the beaker down, wiping his mouth with a cloth. Once I'd tended to him, I raised a paw to point at Morell's sore nose. "Callus bit you?"
"It's just a nip."
Morell gave the marks another rub, then put his paws behind his back, as though to keep them as far from his injury as possible.
"My own fault. Callus ordered me to fetch the Fateseer right away, and I was foolish enough to say that Vizan wasn't well."
His claws made a regular pit-a-pit sound against the uneven stones of the floor as he wiggled his toes, and I smelled impatience mingled with anxiety. Clearly he had no wish to incur more of the Prime's displeasure by returning without a Fateseer. Neither did I, but Callus won't want me praying over his egg. Vizan was his sire's Fateseer, and his grandsire's. I'm just an apprentice.
No.
Vizan's voice was little more than a thread, but there was surprising strength in his wrinkled paw as he clutched my arm.
You must go, Zarda. You have the sight. You are the Fateseer now. Go. Go with Morell.
Vizan. I hesitated, too afraid to voice the questions that had been gnawing at my thoughts since the Prime's egg was laid. What if the hatchling is like the others? What might happen if he too is crippled? It wasn't a question I could have imagined asking a couple of moons ago. The sun shone by day, the spiral watched over us by night, the moon waxed and waned every 54 days, and every Drax could fly. Even after the sickness had taken so many in the growing season, there had been no reason to imagine that the survivors would face the horror of hatching deformed offspring from their late batch of eggs. Vizan seemed to sense what I couldn't put into words, and his grip on my arm tightened.
We saw him, Zarda,
He croaked.
in the dream smoke.
He coughed, and his next words came in ones and twos, forced out between snatched breaths that rattled in his chest.
The visions are never wrong. Never.
I could see he was trying to set his ears upright to indicate his sincerity, though he was now so feeble they did little more than twitch.
This hatchling will lead victory over the Goth.
I glanced up at Morell and saw my own doubt reflected in the set of his ears. The mountain-dwelling Koth had raided and pillaged our farms since the spiral first shone in the sky. It was true that I'd shared Vizan's astonishing vision, but still I had trouble accepting it as fact. Vizan must have sensed my doubt.
You saw it too. We both saw.
He began to cough, and I reached again for the beaker, but he waved a paw toward the door, and I read anger in his one open eye.
Put on the badge. Go.
Very well, but only if Morell agrees to fetch a healer to look after you. Vizan rasped something that might have been,
I don't need looking after.
but I waited till Morell nodded agreement.
"I'll fetch Doran. She's the nearest since Samor died, but not until after I've taken you to Callus. We can't afford to waste any more time."
It would have to do. At least I could trust Doran to brew the right mixture for Vizan. She had visited often while I nursed him, bringing plants and herbs for his medicines, and helping me to blend and mix them as we talked. She and I had been hatched in the same cluster, spent our first cycle together, and had expected to remain within a few dwellings of each other throughout our lives. Even when the sight came to me as a half-grown, I did not think to be taken to the Fateseer, since he already had an apprentice far more gifted than I would ever be. But the sickness came, the apprentice and his successor died, and there was no one else for Vizan to teach. Doran had moved from our hatching place too, but we'd remained friends, and I could always rely on her to tell me the latest news from the Expanse.
She will talk my ears off,
muttered Vizan, his voice a strained whisper. I smoothed his matted mane, something I would never have dared do if he had been well. You will enjoy hearing all her news.
She has an egg.
He broke off to cough again. Mayak can keep it warm. I left the beaker where Vizan could reach it and stood up, ushering Morel ahead of me as we moved around the screen to the living space. I saw his snout wrinkle again, and I realised that I'd not kept the place as tidy as I would have if Vizan had not been sick. A stack of unlicked bowls sat on the workbench next to a pile of unsorted herbs. A blob of bran meal had dropped onto the table from one of the bowls, and the smell of unwashed tunics rose from the basket beside the screen. I hesitated, wondering whether I might take a moment to clear the worst of the mess away. I could at least put the waste bucket outside. But Morel had already spotted the Fate Seer's silver badge of office, and he plucked it from the hook behind the door, holding it out for me to take. Soft light from the westering sun angled through the seashell, making the badge, with its intricate spiral pattern of raised dots, sparkle. I spiraled a paw over my chest, seeking strength. I couldn't do this. Yet, if not me, then who? Morel was hopping from foot to foot, his ears twisting in alarm.
Come on, Zarda, take it. We have to go.
The badge was cool and light in my paw, its circular edge worn near the top, where generations of Fate Seers had held it while they pinned it on. Feeling the weight of their legacy, I hesitated for a heartbeat more before I fastened it to the front of my tunic. As I smoothed the black and white striped fabric, I realised that it was stained with grease and Kestock syrup, but a glance at Morel's impatient ear-twitching told me there was no time to change. I took a moment to brush my fur, comb my whiskers, and wipe my paws, then set my ears straight and tried to keep my tail still. "I'm ready." That was untrue. I had been nervous enough on the few occasions that I had been admitted to Callus' presence, and there had been no need then for me to do more than dip a bow and set my ears and wings to the appropriate angle. Vizan had taken me with him to observe, and Callus had taken no more notice of me than he had of Vizan's shadow. Now I was being asked to take Vizan's place, not merely to speak, but to watch over Callus' egg and pray for the hatchling. Pray? I wasn't even sure I could remember the correct words for the occasion, let alone put them in the right order. Morel didn't hear the doubt in my voice, though. He half raised his wings and dipped his ears to acknowledge Vizan, turned and ducked out through the doorway. I peered around the screen to give Vizan a last glance, half hoping that he would sit up and declare that he felt much better, but his eyes were closed again and he rasped a snore. There was nothing for it but to follow Morel outside. Vizan's dwelling was the central point of the High Council cluster. Not for the first time, I wished that there was enough room on the curving pathway for me to spread my wings and fly over the other dwellings on the isolated mesa. The thought had hardly grazed my mind when the long shadow of a guard flight patrol skimmed overhead. I looked up to see who was on duty, but against the after-zenith sun, all I could see was a silhouette with a bow in one paw. From where I stood, the trackway spiraled through the cluster, thin soil showing through the moss that covered the rest of the plateau in red tussocks. A delicious aroma of fresh-cooked fish drifted from the next dwelling, where Hapak, the chief artisan, lived, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since dawn. My stomachs grumbled a protest, but I'd long since regurgitated and re-chewed my breakfast. I would have to stay hungry for a while longer. An easterly breeze freshened the air with the scent of waterweed. Half-heard voices from Hapak's dwelling vied with the hiss and rattle of the sea dashing pebbles against the base of the cliffs. The wind was chilly, reminding me that the harvest season was almost over, and I raised the fur on my arms a little, wondering if I might go back inside for a snack and a warmer tunic. Morel, a few steps ahead of me on the winding path, looked back to check I was following, and slapped his tail on the ground to show his exasperation.
Zarda, we do not have time to admire the view.
Without another word, he turned and led the way around the trackway to the Spirax, where the Prime dwelt. The Spirax awed me. It always had. The black cone towered over the councillors' dwellings as a mountain dwarfs the foothills around it. Some said it had been built by the god of the great spiral himself, descended from the skies. Others swore that the ancestors had been blessed with special powers. No one had any idea how long it had dominated the landscape, or how long it had taken to construct, for the spirax was not built of stone. It had been carved from the hard black rock of the promontory on which it sat, its tapering sides polished to a shine. When approaching from a distance, it seemed to be one with the sheer cliffs below it. Now, as moved towards it, its surface shone purple under a cloudless blue sky. "Zarda?" The call was heralded by a clatter of wings, and I turned to find Shea, the leader of the hunters, folding her wings and hurrying towards me along the landing path. I always found her rather intimidating, with her sleek brown fur, slender snout, and odour of self-confidence. She had the air of someone who wouldn't even need a waste bucket, let alone forget to put it outside. At least she wasn't carrying her spear. She would not have been allowed to land on the plateau if she'd still had that in her paw. "My egg will be hatching in a few days. Would you ask Bizan to attend on it? She stopped and looked down her snout at the badge I wore. Her stare was disapproving, the set of her ears disbelieving, and I reached up a paw to touch the badge, reminding myself that Vizan had told me to take it. "I have Vizan's authority."
And an urgent summons from Callis.
Morell's ears twisted with impatience, his whiskers quivering as he shifted his weight from foot to foot.
"We can't delay, Shea. I'm sure Zarda will visit your egg as soon as she can."
"It wasn't Zarda I asked for," she said, flicking an ear dismissively. "I'll be on my way. There's a dead floater over the estuary. We need to haul it down before the breeze carries it over the expanse. We don't want it falling on one of the clusters." As she turned to head for the nearest take-off spot, she added, "It's dangerous work, not something we leave to the apprentices." Morell gave me no time to contemplate her point.
"Come on, Zarda. The egg will have hatched by the time we get there."
Hurrying through the spirax's eastern entrance in Morell's wake, I switched to night vision as I followed him through the vast feasting hall. I glanced up at the concave ceiling, where huge sea-tash bones had been positioned to look as though they were keeping the roof in place. I had no time, though, to stop and admire the effect, or to get more than a cursory whiff of the residue of ancient meals which permeated the walls. The rock underfoot was cool and smooth, bare of any floor covering or furniture, since the hall was so rarely used. Only when the next prime succeeded Callis would the fires be lit in the huge hearths, and stools and tables be brought from storage. At the far end of the hall, an ornate arched doorway, twice my height and wide enough for me to spread my wings had I been allowed to, led to a wide passageway that curved upward. There were torches here. They lined the walls in burnished copper brackets, and oily smoke wisped around our feet as we toiled upward. Narrower corridors to our right, some lit, most dark, led to rooms in the centre of the edifice, and Vizan had once told me that there was a narrower, stepped corridor further in, which wound the opposite way to the sloping passage Morell and I were clambering up. Apart from a murmuring of voices and clattering of pots as we passed the cooking chambers on the lower levels, the sole sound I could hear was the slough of our feet against the polished black floor. That and my breathing, which was, I must admit, a little laboured by the time we turned into one of the horizontal passages that took us toward the middle of the rock. I was grateful for the momentary pause outside the nesting chamber door as Morell knocked and waited. Warm from the climb, I pressed a paw against the smooth passageway wall and opened my mouth to draw cool air over my tongue. It refreshed me a little, but did nothing to quell my anxiety. I didn't hear Callis' command to enter, but obviously Morell did, for he opened the door with a flourish, dipped his ears as he moved into the room, and stepped to one side to allow me to enter the chamber.
"Lord, I regret to report that Vizan is unwell," he announced. "He sends Zarda as Fate-Seer in his place."
I set my wings and ears to the appropriate angle and bowed low, then straightened up and waited for Callis' command.
Zara, the apprentice.
Callis' voice dripped with disappointment and displeasure, and I had to make a conscious effort to stop my fur standing on end. The Prime stood beside his nestmate, Varna, in the middle of the chamber, next to the platform that held the nest and the egg. Varna, her pale fur bristling with worry, didn't take her eyes from the egg, but Callis stood straight, his bulky, black-furred frame towering over me. His white tunic glowed in the light of the torches that lined the walls, and the crystals in the badge at his throat sparked red in the torchlight.
What ails Bizan?
He asked, the words bouncing off the walls in a deep rumble.
Is it the sickness?
No, Lord. I took one hesitant step forward. He's old. He says it is his time.
Well, it's very inconvenient of him.
Callis' voice became a growl, and I felt that it was not the right moment to point out that Bizan was probably not happy about it either. Callis grunted, flicked a curt ear, then dismissed Morel with a wave of his paw. The herald bowed and scuttled off, the lay of his ears signalling his relief.
I suppose you will have to do,
said Callis.
You have the sight, yes?
Yes, Lord. I almost added that my gift was very slight compared with Bizan's, that it was not even comparable to the 2 apprentices who had preceded me, that I had been a poor third choice for Bizan, and had not had time to learn even half of what he had taught his earlier pupils. But they were dead of the sickness, and I was not, so I clamped my jaw shut on all of that. Callis was already annoyed. No need to add to his impatience.
So tell me, apprentice,
he said, indicating the walls and nest with a circling finger.
Is everything as it should be?
Bizan had been responsible for the arrangements in the chamber, so there was no reason for doubt. Was Callis testing me, or was his question no more than the natural anxiety of any sire about to see his first offspring hatch? Either way, a swift glance around and a brief sniff assured me that all the traditions had been properly observed. Sweet-smelling avalocks had been woven into the nest, lit torches in ancient copper brackets spiralled up the otherwise unadorned walls, winding in overhead to the ceiling's central point. A single candle had been lit to mark the time, and a shard of Callis' own shell, brought from the egg vault, had been placed in the nest itself. I flicked an ear to acknowledge Limar, the nest nurse, who was sitting on the raised nesting platform, stroking the coarse purple shell and murmuring encouragement to the occupant within, then turned my attention back to Callis. It's perfect, Lord, I assured him, with a little dip of my head. All that's necessary now are the traditional prayers.
You know them?
I hoped that my doubt wasn't too tangible. Of course, Bizan is an excellent teacher. I stepped closer to the nest and spiralled a paw across the front of my tunic. Spiral give me strength, I thought. Aloud I said, Great Spiral, look kindly on this hatchling. Give it the strength, the wisdom, and the stamina to learn well and to fly far, as its ancestors have done. Let it be guided by your lights, and look to your pattern for understanding and enlightenment. Let it grow to be a good and true leader, as its forebears have before it. So it has always been.
May it so remain.
No sooner had Callis and Varna spoken the refrain and spiralled their paws over their tunics, than a crack split the egg's shell with a faint tearing sound. Around me the odour of anticipation and excitement grew stronger. Limar gave the egg a little pat, her posture and odour exuding self-importance. That's it, she said, her voice strong but soothing. Tap a little harder now, you're nearly through. She could, of course, have ripped the shell apart with her own claws, but that would not encourage the strongest. If the hatchling couldn't break out of its own shell, it would ultimately be too weak to survive. It must prove itself from the start, or die. Tiny cracks crept down the sides of the egg, every minute split greeted with bleats of hope and excitement from Varna. This wasn't her first hatchling, of course. She had produced Limar from her proving egg with a guard flight mate 2 cycles ago, but her new pup would be prime some day, Spiral willing, unless... I pushed my doubts aside, remembering the vision that Bizan and I had shared. This hatchling was destined for great things. There was no way he could be affected by his damned sickness in the way that others had been. Could he? Silence. Was the hatchling too weak to break out? How long were we supposed to wait before declaring it a cracked shell? What was the protocol for proper disposal? I glanced from egg to candle, candle to egg, sending wordless prayers to the spiral that the hatching would resume before the flame went out. My feet ached and I wiggled my toes, cringing at the noise my claws made on the cold rock floor. If only tradition allowed for stools in the nesting chamber. A ripping noise heralded another crack around the top of the eggshell, and I forgot my discomfort as I began to murmur the traditional incantations. I stood to one side of the platform, looking over the egg toward its parents, who were holding on to each other as they stood on the far side of the nest, breathing encouragement. As tiny claws appeared and began to break the shell apart from within, Callis gave a shout of joy and licked Ivana, who was snuffling with happiness. The tiny creature pushed away the entire top of its egg, and everyone in the room roared delight at the sight of the white mane on its head and neck. The nest nurse got to her feet, her ears twitching with excitement. "A male!" she exclaimed, as proud as though she had produced him herself. The hatchling struggled out of the bottom half of the shell into his nest, his fur still wet, chest heaving from his exertions, and the roars died away. Varna howled, pulled away from Callis, and backed away, shaking her head. Lemar, who had been reaching to pick up the infant, stayed her hand and looked at the prime, awaiting guidance, but Callis appeared to be too horror-struck to speak. It was I who reached down to pick him up. I too was astounded, and not a little afraid. My teacher, the Fate-Seer, had predicted that this infant would be the saviour of his people, a great prime who would lead the Dracs to victory against their greatest enemy. I couldn't understand how this horror could have happened, how all the portents and signs could have been so wrong.
Zarda.
Callis found his voice at last, sounding the more terrifying for speaking so softly.
Vizan told me that this nestling would be the hero of our people, that he would be the prime who would finally defeat the Koth and halt their raids forever. Tell me, how is he to become that when he is born deformed?
His paws clenched, and his voice rose to an anguished roar.
He has no wings!